Tonight that what administration officials characterized as an immediate threat by Iran against American interests in the Middle East has diminished as of now. Today, lawmakers received briefings from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Acting Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan, and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Joe Dunford. National Security Correspondent Jennifer Griffin reports tonight from the Pentagon.
It was not very enlightening.
Democrats who demanded national security briefings in the wake of escalating tensions with Iran remain skeptical that the administration had a plan to avoid a war.
We know Iran is bad, okay? What is the policy going forward? There wasn't enough information on that.
A war with Iran would be an absolute disaster, and I hope the American people tell this administration that we will not go to war.
This is blind escalation with the hope that the Iranians will come to the table in the end.
Republican lawmakers had a different reaction.
It was a very good briefing. They explained to us how the Iranian threat streams were different than in the past, that the attack on the ships and the pipeline was coordinated and directed by the Iranian government.
There's no intention to go to war in the region. This is a deterrent operation to stop Iran's escalation.
Acting Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan defended the intelligence that led the Pentagon to deploy the USS Abraham Lincoln ahead of schedule.
That intelligence is borne out in attacks, and I would say it's also deterred attacks. We have deterred attacks based on our reposturing of assets, deterred attacks against American forces.
We walked through our efforts and our ultimate objective over the past days, which has been to deter Iran.
Iran's foreign minister ruled out negotiating with the Trump administration, warning third parties may try to pull Iran and the U.S. into a direct confrontation.
We believe that the United States is playing a very, very dangerous game.
General Joe Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, has canceled a trip to NATO due to, quote, unforeseen commitments that require him to remain in Washington, D.C., a sign that tensions remain. Brett?
Jennifer Griffin at the Pentagon. Jennifer, thank you. Up next, former U.S. Special Operations Commander Admiral William McRaven on his career and what he thinks of U.S. policy on Iran now. Tonight, a special perspective on the U.S. military presence in the Middle East. Joining us is retired Admiral William McRaven, who commanded U.S. Special Operations Forces during some of the most active years there. The Admiral is author of a new book, Sea Stories, My Life in Special Operations. I started by asking him how concerned he was about the latest threats from Iran and the actions to try to deter them.
I'm not as concerned as a lot of people are, Brett. The fact of the matter is, we have been dealing with Iran for decades. And I know the folks in Iraq, if they have a credible threat against the forces there, they will increase the security posture. They will know how to deal with that threat. If it turns out there is a strike against U.S. forces, then I know we will have a prepared, measured response to the Iranians. The fact of the matter is, the president doesn't want to go to a war in Iran, and the Iranians certainly don't want the U.S. to go to war. And as long as there's no miscalculation on either side's part, I think we're going to be fine.
Well, when you're dealing with a guy like Qasem Soleimani, right, the head of the Revolutionary Guard, I mean, that's a bad character, right?
Well, but I think Soleimani is absolutely a bad character, but he is predictable, I think, and I'm not worried about Soleimani. What I'm worried about are, the young officers who are enlisted in some of these fast attack boats that come out to engage the U.S. fleet, and one of them decides to kind of get off the reservation and go a little further than planned. This will obviously elicit a response from the Navy. But again, the Navy's been doing this for decades. They know how to deal with these fast attack boats. The Army and the forces we have in Iraq, they will know how to deal with the threats that are there. So, I don't expect that the Iranians are going to come at us kind of full force. I think I think the Iranians are smarter than that. If they do, they will regret that move.
I want to ask you about another thing that's happening real time now, and that is the consideration of pardons or clemency for some military members. Do you know Special Operations Chief Eddie Gallagher, a Navy SEAL?
Yeah, I do not know Eddie Gallagher.
Yeah,
no.
But he's getting ready to stand trial on charges of shooting an unarmed civilian in Iraq and killing an enemy captive with a knife. Do you think the president should be pardoning these folks?
Yeah, I think the president needs to be very careful at this point in time. Obviously, the president can pardon whoever he thinks it's appropriate to pardon. But as you know, Brett, the way it works in the military is you have to be careful as a senior commander about unduly influencing the process before the investigation has been adjudicated, before it has either gone to courts-martial, before it has gone to a trial, or before it's gone to a captain's mast, as we say in the Navy. So the fact of the matter is a senior officer is not allowed to imply how he thinks the investigation should come out. That is called unduly influencing the investigation. So by the president signaling that he wants to or might, pardon any individual, I'm concerned that that unduly influences the commanders below him. Now, once the trial is over and the president has an opportunity to read all the evidence and make a decision, obviously he's well within his rights to pardon whoever he thinks it's appropriate to do so.
Your book is a really great read. One of the best parts is the play-by-play on the bin Laden raid, and you're overseeing all of that. Were you disappointed after you had on the ground the time to get this treasure trove of information that it really never got exploited from an intelligence point of view?
Well, I'm not sure it didn't get exploited. The fact of the matter is, we went in there assuming that bin Laden at this point in time was probably a figurehead, that he really wasn't involved in operations, in the planning of operations against the U.S. or our allies. And clearly what the intelligence showed from Abbottabad was he wasn't as far removed as we thought. And in fact, he was engaged in future planning. So I think, we have to be careful about saying we didn't exploit the intelligence. I think we learned a lot from the intelligence. Well, it depends on what you mean by fully. It's hard. Yeah, it is hard sometimes when you have a threat stream to be able to take that threat stream from point A to point Z and then put troops on the ground to resolve the problem. Having said that, I think the agency did a great job with the intelligence they got, and the American public may never know the threats that were stopped or the attacks that were stopped as a result of that intelligence.
One of the people who was against that raid was Vice President Biden. Bob Gates was recently asked about Vice President Biden, and now running for president, obviously, and he said in his book, Joe is a man of integrity and capable of hiding what he really thinks, and one of those rare people who you could turn to for a personal crisis. Still, I think he's been wrong on nearly every major foreign policy and national security issue over the past 4 decades. He was asked about it recently. He said he might have some problem with senior military. What do you think about all that?
Well, I've had a lot of dealings with Vice President Biden, and I have found him to be very personable, very engaging. He has been a good friend, I would tell you. And again, in the development of the bin Laden raid, there were a number of people who didn't think the raid was a good idea. Secretary Gates has a better understanding of Vice President Biden's history on national security issues, more so than I do. Having said that, again, I like Vice President Biden, and I wish him well in the race.
And what about the governing you're seeing from a military perspective from President Trump?
Well, I think we probably don't give President Trump enough credit for some of the national security things he's done. I mean, the strike against Syria a couple of years ago, I think that was exactly the right thing to do. It was a measured response when Assad used chemical weapons. You look at his engagement with Kim Jong-un. Now, it didn't turn out like we wanted, but the fact of the matter is, I think engaging with the North Koreans was probably the right thing to do. His pressure on China, again, I'm not sure I like the way he's going about doing it, but I think China's got to be pressured. China has to be held accountable. And the other issue is Maduro. So you look how he's pressuring Venezuela right now. Now, again, I wish he would work more with the Latin countries down there. But in some cases, he has actually taken the right steps, I think, from a national security standpoint. I think this is a result of listening to his military commanders, like Chairman Joe Dunford. I think it is like listening to Secretary Mike Pompeo, who is a very thoughtful guy. So as long as the president continues to listen to some thoughtful advisors that he's got, I think he'll do fine. Now, again, I think some of the rhetoric, some of the bombastic rhetoric is probably more than we need at this point in time. But he has had some successes in the national security arena, and I think we have to give him credit for those.
Well, Admiral McRaven, thank you for your service, and the book is a great read. Again, Sea Stories, My Life in Special Operations. We appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
President Trump versus former Vice President Joe Biden. What would that matchup look like potentially? We'll head to Pennsylvania when we come back. In America's election headquarters tonight, voters in Pennsylvania are deciding a special congressional election tonight. that President Trump calls a bit of a referendum on his time in office. The voting comes as native son Joe Biden is leading the president in the latest head-to-head poll matchups. Correspondent Peter